What's up? What's up? What's up?
Hello.
So I think everybody, but Jason so far has been on the TART program multiple times now at this point. But Godless Engineer, we'll start with you, and just so you guys know, we have everything in the description, all the links and everything. But Godless Engineer, tell them a little bit about you and where they can find you.
All right. Well, I am the Godless Engineer. You can find me over on Godless Engineer here on YouTube. Also, pretty much any other social media platform, I'm Godless Engineer. If you want to go to the your respective app stores, I do have an app in there called Crestus. It is a paid app, but it's got a lot of great information about the topic that we're discussing here tonight. So, I'm trying to get it ready for a really big update that's going to be coming out soon. So definitely go down there and get it, or go to your app store and get it.
Yep, and that's I've had that app for quite a while now, and it was badass in the beginning, but it keeps, as the updates have came, it gets better and better. So for the atheist community, you have those questions you like studying, that's a great resource for the community. So we'll wait for Jason to get back on here. Bradley, Seamus, welcome back to the Atheist Roundtable, and tell us a little about alternate media. What do you guys do? How can they find you?
Well, here at Alternate Media, what we try and do is present informative material pertaining to the Bible and biblical times, historically speaking, culturally speaking, that is not typically readily available in Christian circles. So a lot of what we say, most Christians probably wouldn't agree with, but we're also more than willing to debate that subject too. So.
Yeah, I would say our mission here at Alternate Media, like our mission statement, is it's biblical teachings with a very heavy emphasis on historical and cultural context, and trying to return that original thought process back into the Bible that has been since removed over the 2,000 years of otherworldly influence, essentially. So we're basically a history channel that focuses primarily on the Bible.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's a good, simple way of, a very good, simple way of putting that in encapsulating it. Jason, are you with us?
Yeah, for some reason, my capture card for my camera just died. So I guess that means that y'all don't have to see my ugly mug until I can get this fixed. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, go ahead and give yourself an introduction, and then what I'll do is when Seamus and Bradley are sharing, I'll pull you and Godless off screen for a minute. That way you can take care of that.
Okay. So I run a secular Bible study podcast with a focus on comparative mythology, essentially looking at different Bible stories and comparing them to other Near Eastern myths that may have had an influence on the creation of the stories that you find in the Bible. And it's a monthly show, and that's basically it. That's who I am and what I do. Unless you want to hear about me driving a truck around the country, but that's boring.
Well, we'll save that for another debate. How about that?
Perfect.
No, we appreciate it, Jason. And for those that aren't familiar with Jason's podcast, and he recently started up on YouTube as well. Again, tons of great information if you're researching into the history, the mythology of Jesus, in the Bible. Tons of great material there. But so for everybody watching, the format's going to be very simple tonight. Each side's going to have a 10-minute opening, and then we're going to go straight to an open dialogue, and we'll have little segment breakups in there. So if it happens, don't get caught off guard, because it will happen. And one thing you should know, if you've watched the Atheist Roundtable before, or if this is your first time, we do our best to be unpredictable. So keep you on your toes. So if we cut in, we'll be polite. We won't just jump in the middle of a conversation, but we will break segments up. But Bradley and Seamus, they're going to go first. So I will make sure my stopwatch is ready. Give me 1 second here. All right, and I'll take Godless off the screen here. As soon as you guys begin to speak, I'll start your 10 minutes, okay?
All right. So I think in introduction here to this topic, probably what's going to be discussed a lot is going to be standards of evidence. So what I'd like to begin with is the dictionary definition of evidence. Now, granted, there are different dictionaries. I'm just pulling from dictionary.com. I didn't really take the time to look at others, but I'm sure there are others. But the first definition is that which tends to prove or disprove something. Ground for belief, proof. I feel like there's probably another definition that would indicate that evidence is fact. I don't necessarily agree with that, because if it's a fact, then we don't need evidence for it. It simply is immutably. Evidence is what we do need for something that is not an established fact, and based on the culmination of evidence, we can determine the likelihood of whether or not it did or didn't happen, is or isn't true, what have you. So that's primarily what we're going to be discussing here, is the available evidence that there is. So I don't really have a whole lot more to say on that. There was one other thing, but it's slipping my mind.
I can take over from there
Yeah,
until then. So my role here at Ultimate Media is actually sort of the historian. And so I have a set of standards that most historians follow that I also follow. When it comes to using anything as a viable source for any pattern of evidence. Two of which I'm going to use the most tonight are the law of multiple attestation and the law of dissimilarity. And in summary, multiple attestation is when you have more than one account working independently from another, not together, and not off of each other, and containing similarities within account in order to give us an idea of what actually happened. So multiple attestation. And then dissimilarity is actually this law is akin to like a mother giving a testimony against her son in a court of law. In a court of law, this law of dissimilarity means that her testimony holds more weight, because it does not benefit her in any way to give testimony against her son. And so it's more likely that her testimony is true, regardless of the fact that it is, that because it would go against her otherwise. So dissimilarity, it would be things that are recorded that Christianity would like to see done away with, more or less. So that gives us an indication that it actually happened, and that it was made up by Christians. Usually when Christians tamper with documents and make things up, they try to make everything parallel and line up very neatly and nicely to fit all other accounts. And usually if that is the case, then we pull that away from the law of dissimilarity and check it against multiple attestation. But the two together, if you can get both together, it's even better. And then the third one is time. The closer you are to the original source, the more authoritative it becomes. And so that being said, essentially we intend to prove via dialogue, argument, debate, what have you, from a historical perspective, that there are other figures in history that we accept as having been existed, and that we accept in our today's culture as factual, and less evidence exists for their existence than the existence of Jesus. And that being the case, if we accept these historical figures as being factual, then you are forced by the three laws to accept the factuality of Jesus's existence, because of the more evidence that is versus the evidence for the others that aren't. And that's kind of the approach that we're going to take. I will be taking a history approach mostly, and then my colleague actually has prepared his own version of the argument from his particular perspective. And so, unless you have more to add to that.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing that I kind of tend to focus on, particularly with the subject matter, is nature and human nature pertaining to natural occurrences. Things that are natural tend to be repetitive. So if the argument is going to be such that human nature is to fabricate persons or things, then I'm probably going to require evidence of other persons that have been fabricated in history, because logically speaking, there would be more of those than any other actual historical figures.
That depends. I don't know if that's okay. That's your
natural occurrences are repetitive.
I know, but from a historian's perspective, I don't know about that particular version of that argument. But so I'll wrap it up real quick. Essentially, we think that there is plenty enough evidence to say that Jesus existed. Whether or not he is who he says he is or what his followers says he is irrelevant to this discussion. This discussion is purely on whether or not he did exist. We believe that there is enough evidence to suggest that he did at least exist as a person, and that whether or not he claims who he was or who his followers claims that he is completely irrelevant. Hello again. I guess it's your guys' turn.
Yeah.
All right. So mythical figures are typically created in one of two ways. Either they begin as a historical figure and later have extraordinary deeds attached to their story, or they begin as a myth and are later inserted into history. The end result of both processes can be indistinguishable from one another, but if we look back at early versions of the story, that's when the differences begin to emerge. In the case of historical figures, we find tales of a person, perhaps exaggerated but mostly believable, like Alexander the Great. But as the story progresses through time, it grows in the telling until the person becomes more mythic and sometimes even godlike. In the case of mythic figures, it's quite different. Our oldest stories are that of a fictional character or a divine spirit, even a god or an angel. And then, sometime later, the myth is turned into a man. This is a process known as euhemerization after the 4th century BC Greek mythographer Euhemerus, who invented fictive biographies for gods such as Zeus, and then inserted them into history as if the gods were based on real people instead of the other way around. So our stories there begin with a myth, and it's only later that we encounter tales of a man. So which of these processes best describes our evidence for Jesus? If we're talking about historical evidence that is found outside of Christian literature, we really don't have much. Our earliest reference to Jesus doesn't arrive until the early 2nd century AD, and that's only a reference to what Christians in the time of Tacitus believe. If you look at the Gospels, which are our only biographical information of Jesus, we find a host of contradictions, beginning with conflicting birth narratives and ending with conflictive resurrection narratives. And they're written so long after the events that they portray that it's unlikely any eyewitnesses would have still been around to relate the story to our 4 anonymous authors. Not that they even name any sources. But if we include our earliest Christian writings, those that predate the Gospel of Mark, such as our 7 authentic letters of Paul, then what we find is something quite extraordinary. Paul expresses no apparent knowledge of an earthly Jesus. He speaks of knowing Jesus not through oral testimony, as we would expect, but through divine revelation in Jewish scripture. Even knowledge of his crucifixion was discovered in Scripture. His Jesus was killed by mysterious forces called rulers of this age and began appearing to people such as Cephas and James after his resurrection. His Jesus existed at the beginning of time. He shows no apparent knowledge of Jesus working miracles, being born on earth, suffering at the hands of Pontius Pilate, being crucified by the Romans, walking on water, counting 153 fish, or personally hanging out with the disciples. In fact, Paul never even uses the word disciples in his letters, not even once. When speaking about Cephas and James, who will later be cast as lead disciples, Paul only knows of these people as apostles like himself. And this discrepancy in regards to the nature of Jesus never appears in the numerous arguments between Paul and James and Cephas. They don't seem to notice that Paul is preaching a celestial figure that disagrees with any other theology. Their only concern is centered around kosher food and foreskin. But it's not only Paul who behaves in this manner. This strange pattern continues in other writings such as the Epistle to the Hebrews and Jude and James. Even non-canonical writings like 1 Clement, written as late as 95 AD, makes numerous references to the epistles and Old Testament scriptures, but it even lacks any clear reference to Jesus ever being on earth or any material that we can conclusively link to the Gospels. But it gets even worse than that. As late as the 3rd century, Christian theologians such as Origen openly state that the historical portions of Scripture were meant as allegory to convey the deeper message. And one early gospel, a contemporary of Mark, or perhaps even earlier, explicitly places the passion, death, and resurrection in the firmament and perpetrated by demons and not by Romans. And the core of the Christian gospel, that an innocent servant of God named Jesus would be wrongly executed despite his innocence, die to atone for all sins in a single day, ascend to heaven, and build up God's church, doesn't need a historical man to invent it, because it was already spelled out in Jewish scripture, just as our earliest Christian writings say that it was. So if we find that Christians believed not in a man, but a God, and this God was based on older ideas, and the later novels, which included his biographical information, not only contradict history, but also themselves, and were understood not as recording history, but as allegory, then the life and character of Jesus might make more sense if we attempt to understand it as the earliest surviving Christian writings claim it is, as a celestial drama which was central to a messianic Jewish mystery religion that offered personal salvation apart from the Jerusalem temple.
All right, I guess it's my turn. I've spent a lot of time researching this topic, and I'm always looking for somebody to persuade me away from my position. So I'm really glad that we're talking with you two guys tonight. I don't know if you will be able to persuade me, but if multiple attestation and dissimilarity are the ways that you're going to go, I feel like you're going to have a bad time. So I come at the question of the historicity of Jesus from a pretty simple foundation, and that's that the prior probability of a savior deity like Jesus being a real person works heavily against Jesus existing in history. There are multiple savior deities that have existed in the past. All of them have been made up, not real, and have had fictional historical accounts of them made. And so given that, what I would need is a lot of evidence to suggest that Jesus was the outlier in this situation. Hard evidence would be good, but I mean, even one reference would be good that at least is not dubious. But we seem to not find that anywhere in history. It's quite interesting because in the opening statements of our opponents tonight, they said that we accept other historical figures with, I guess, less evidence or like lesser quality evidence or something of that nature. That's not actually true. And in my Crestus app, I actually have a very long, detailed section comparing the evidence that we have for Jesus to the evidence that we have for a lot of the historical figures that he's normally compared to. So I definitely implore you guys to test both me and the information that I've collected on any one particular historical figure that you think we accept as existing in history that has lesser evidence for him. But essentially, what my position comes down to is the fact that savior deities, as Jesus is described in the Bible, both by Paul and by the Gospels, simply have never been shown to actually exist in history. And so it seems to me the rational conclusion to make is that, well, unless we have good evidence to overcome this prior probability, then we should also not regard Jesus to be a historical figure in history. Now, I do have a lot of supporting evidence for my position, and maybe we can go through that. I know that I missed the time call out there for how long I got, but 2 minutes, great. But I definitely implore our opponents tonight to give us some good evidence, like give us examples of the multiple attestation that you talked about, because as far as I can tell, every written source that we have is ultimately based off of Paul's writings. And then historians have come up with these hypothetical documents that we just simply don't have. So I would love to hear the multiple attestation. And then you got the criterion of dissimilarity. That has a lot of problems with it. One thing that I can directly call out is how in legal proceedings now, the whole what's essentially criterion of dissimilarity in legal proceedings has actually been called into question as to its validity numerous times. So I don't see how you're hoping to use the criterion of dissimilarity in order to help your case. And so, yeah, I guess I'll just wait for some specific claims, and maybe we can. I don't know if we're gonna go into a discussion period right after this, but hey, I'm really interested to hear what evidence y'all got.
What's up, everybody? So while the debaters get a chance to have a drink of water or soda or other things, I just want to jump on and say thank you so much for the opening statements. And we're going to go straight into the open dialogue tonight. I felt like this was a topic that just needs to be openly discussed and not have the different parts of the format, so to speak. So we will jump in here and there just to give them a break, kind of break things up. But it'll be respectful. And we'll make sure it's not like right in the middle of the heated, part or interesting part. So don't worry about that. But I did want to jump in while they have a little break and say, remember, we are doing a TART live watch party for the McGregor fight immediately after the debate. If you want to be a part of that, obviously we can't stream it. That would be illegal, but we're gonna have basically we're gonna have a party in my man cave, which is Zoom, and we're gonna hang out. So if you want to be a part of that, email me austin@tart.live, and I will get you the links to be a part of that. It's just going to be chill out, watch the fights, have some fun, chop it up. Because, well, one, we all don't live close to each other, but there's still that whole COVID thing, that damn COVID thing. So at least we can do that to hang out and get to know each other a little more. And the next thing we're going to do, like I said, is the open conversation. We'll go about, since we're not doing those segments, probably about 50 minutes. I'll have a stopwatch going, but we'll jump in here and there, have some fun in between, depending on the conversations going. So I'll bring them up, bring the competitors back on screen.
All right. I guess I don't know if maybe you guys can go, since we kind of finished last. I feel like you guys can probably bring out what issues you got with anything that we said. Oh, I don't know. Is it only me? I can't hear you guys.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah,
Perfect.
gotcha.
Okay, that would be why when I started talking, you talked immediately over me, and I was like, "Is it what in the world?" Okay, that makes sense now.
Is he being a dick?
Yeah, no, we just don't like you.
We're used to that.
Yeah, that's fine. Usually it's the Christians that hate us, but okay. I wrote a few things down. I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to go over specifically.
You can go over what you wrote down. I made a couple of mental notes, but nothing that's particularly pertaining to the topic at hand.
Sure. So one claim was that some of the earliest stuff that we have is from the 2nd century time frame. Now, usually a lot of people like to remove any of the biblical texts as some sort of witness account. Mm-hmm. But Mark is written somewhere as early as 65 AD. Mm-hmm. And then we have Matthew, who, according to Papias, actually wrote his gospel originally in Hebrew. Eventually that Hebrew gospel was lost over time. But
Eusebius also confirms that.
Yeah, well, it's actually Eusebius who is quoting Papias there, because a lot of Papias's work were also lost over time. But there's a few things that Papias talks about. Matthew's gospel, he talks about what happened with John the Baptist and his death narrative. And one thing that one thing that the Star Wars shirt, I can't remember your name. I'm so sorry.
Godless Engineer.
Godless Engineer. Okay. You wanted to know more about the law of dissimilarity. And allow me to go a little further on that now that we have some more time. Dissimilarity is not irrefutable evidence. It is something that you can add to help to show within a historian's mindset that something would be unaltered by time. Usually what you have is a problem with like pseudepigraphas, where somebody will write a letter and attribute it to somebody like Paul or one of the apostles, and it's a fake document. And one of the ways that we can know that it's a fake document is it's entirely too parallel with other documents that were accepted at that time, in which case it does not meet the law of dissimilarity. Whereas things that have differing accounts or differing details would tell us that it's a unique and unaltered source, and it's unaltered at least by the party it would be helping, because it has information in it that would otherwise be unhelping to the party that uses it as evidence. Such as a differing date for the death of Jesus would be one of those. The law of dissimilarity would then apply to the book of John against the book of Matthew, where the dates are a little altered. And so that's one way to say that John and Matthew worked independently of each other, and so they were not working together in order to rewrite their accounts. And that's how dissimilarity is.
Well, so I would actually take option C and say that John was written in the 2nd century and was copying from his previous gospel counterparts. They don't have to be directly working together. John actually redacts a lot of the previous gospels. Like, for instance, John's Lazarus is actually a response and redaction of Luke's Lazarus, because if for those of you that don't know, there's 2 different Lazaruses in the Gospels. The first Lazarus that was written about is in Luke, and it's actually a parable where Lazarus is a dying peasant man that is asking Jesus to come back to life or something like that, but or maybe it's God. I can't remember exactly right now, but
I
in
think
any
he
case,
asks Abraham.
or maybe it's
Yeah.
Abraham. Yeah.
He's dead, and he asks. I think he asks Abraham.
Right.
Yeah.
But in any case, he ends up not coming back from the dead. So, I mean, that's a whole parable that's meant to teach a lesson, right? In John, he actually takes Luke's version of Lazarus and he makes him into a real person via reification. And so, go ahead, Jason.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, so John shows that he knows Luke's gospel and is actually refuting it by turning Lazarus into a real person that Jesus has resurrected from the dead. Now, you might be asking, well, why does he think he has to resurrect somebody from the dead? Well, that goes all the way back to Elijah and Elisha, because both of them had I think it's both of them. If not both of them, just Elijah, one of them. They actually have instances of resurrecting people. One of them was a bunch of people that was going to be stealing stuff from tombs, and one of them fell down into a hole, died, but then Elijah or Elisha's bones touched him, and he sprang back to life. So, I mean, the New Testament authors were scouring the scriptures for things Jesus is supposed to do, and that's one of them. And so we know that John knew Luke's account, his gospel, right? So he had that one. Luke, we know, copied from both Mark and Matthew copied from Mark. So there's only one independent gospel that we actually have, and that's Mark's gospel. But even then,
that would be a false statement.
Well, hold on. Mark got most of his theology, at least, from Paul. So, I mean, ultimately, everything that we have like written evidence for ultimately stems from Paul. So, I mean, You just like to say that the gospel authors did not have access or did not use the other gospels, and so therefore they're independent, is just ignoring all of the evidence that we have against that notion.
I think you're misleading all of the evidence that we do have. You're presenting information in such a way that it sounds like it's helping your case, but it isn't. So now we call them the Synoptic Gospels because they happen to have a lot of the same stories, which meets the law of multiple attestation. But only Mark and Matthew are the ones that we can link to having worked together. Luke cannot be linked to Mark and Matthew. There's too many things that are dissimilar between the two of them. But they believe that that Luke is working with a source document. That source document is not Matthew or Mark. Scholars have named this document Q because it is a source document that we don't have. But it's to show that Luke is not working with Matthew or Mark to make his gospel.
Hey, I've got an idea. Why don't I just invent a brand new document right now called the K document, and that's where everything stems from?
No,
I mean, that's essentially what you have, what the Q document, what you guys have just suggested. That we can just make up documents and say that that's where he was working off of, or that's where these gospel authors got their stuff from. Why couldn't they just make it up themselves? Like, what's preventing them from just making stuff up? You know,
okay,
also Luke definitely copied Matthew and Mark.
You're going to have to provide evidence to substantiate that claim with Luke, because Luke, as is accepted by just about every archaeological scholar, drew from a document that we don't know about. We don't make the document up. We just say that he obviously drew his stories from another source, and we currently call that source unnamed.
One of the other things I caught in what you just explained that's gonna need a little bit more evidence to support it is the notion that the two Lazaruses between the two gospels are the same person, but one is a redaction of the other. I'm gonna need a source for that.
Yes.
I didn't say otherwise, you're just making shit up at this point.
Okay, I want to jump in here real quick. So, with the Lazarus in Luke, and then later in John. So Lazarus, he dies, and I think he's. I'm trying to remember this because I haven't studied this particular thing in a while, but he's basically worried about some other people who are going to essentially be misled, and he basically wants to save their souls, and he asks if he can be resurrected because, then he can go back and essentially warn them, and the answer he's given is no, you can't be resurrected, because if they aren't already on the right path, then seeing someone resurrected isn't going to change anything. And then John takes this thing and turns it around and says, okay, he will be resurrected, and his resurrection will lead to the conversions of these other people. And so he takes the thing, and instead of a fictional character in a parable meant to show that not even something, a miracle as grand as a person coming back from the dead can convert somebody, if they're not already on the right path, John says, okay, a resurrection from the dead will convert many people who aren't already on the right path. And Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Robert L. Price have both pointed out a substantial amount of parallels between these two stories. Now, as far as Q, the reason that scholars hypothesized Q is because Matthew copies about 85% of Mark, much of it almost verbatim, and actually a great deal of it is actually word for word, though he does go to great lengths to correct some of the mistakes that Mark makes, such as geography. Mark apparently doesn't know anything about Palestinian geography and puts things in the wrong place, and Matthew comes along and fixes it. And then Luke comes along, and he uses about 50 or 55% of Mark. Again, a great deal of it verbatim. And he also has material that is found in Matthew, but isn't found in Mark. Scholars then were wondering, okay, well, if Matthew has this material and Luke has this material, but Mark doesn't, where are they getting it from? And so they hypothesized a document called Q. But scholars have come along and said, well, there are other instances where it looks like Luke is aware of Matthew. For instance, taking the Sermon on the Mount and saying, no, the sermon was actually down on the plain, and things like that. They say, okay, it looks like Luke knew about Matthew, and if Luke was written even 1 year after the writing of Matthew, then we don't need a hypothetical document to explain similarities between Matthew and Luke that don't exist in Mark. All we need is that, Luke possibly had access to Matthew. And if that's the case, then you don't need to insert a hypothetical document, for phrases attributed to Jesus, because then you just have Luke borrowing them from Matthew. But even if they were both working from what amounts to a book of Proverbs and inserting those in there and attributing these things to Jesus, that isn't exactly independent attestation, because the New Testament authors frequently took quotes. They frequently took words from other people and put them into the mouths of Jesus. The writings of Paul would be one of them. We have a great deal of things that Paul wrote in his letters that later find their way into the mouth of Jesus, such as his prohibition against divorce. That comes almost word for word out of Paul, and also getting rid of the commandments and having just one commandment where you just love your neighbor. Which does that come? I think it's Galatians, I believe. So we have these things. We have numerous quotes from Paul that are later borrowed by the biblical authors. And so we know that early Christians, when creating the Gospels, were taking quotes from other people and attributing them to Jesus. That was very common at the time. That doesn't mean that it's independently attesting to a historical source. It just means they're borrowing from other sources.
So to very quickly revisit the parable of Lazarus, I would be willing to, at least in part, accept what you presented on it if you had actually represented the parable correctly. But as it stands, the person making the plea for any form of a resurrection is actually the rich man in the parable. The idea is that the rich man and Lazarus both die and go to Sheol, which is the grave, as it were. And Lazarus is at the bosom of Abraham, the place of comfort. And the rich man is then in the place of torment. But somehow these compartments are both related or relevant to one another, to where there's communication across those two planes.
It's a parable. It's not meant to be taken literally.
It's not intended to be taken literally. But in this instance, there really isn't any crossover between the resurrection of Lazarus and the actual story of the resurrection of Lazarus. Namely being,
I didn't say there was crossover.
The person requesting to be resurrected.
I didn't say there was crossover. In fact, I said that what John did was it's a reversal of the purpose of the parable. In fact, I literally said that it's a parable, which would imply that it's not something that actually happened.
Yes, but you built that case. You built that case on the assumption that there's any reference to Lazarus being resurrected in the original parable.
The original parable. I don't know what you're.
So the original parable, if we're going to use timelines here, was written before John. John was written about 95 AD, between 90 and 95 AD. And so the parable.
How do we get this date?
Yeah,
that is the currently accepted date per.
These dates are widely disputed. We can't even place Mark as early as 95.
We can place Mark as early as 60 and 65.
Yeah.
Based on what? I mean, he references the destruction of the Jewish temple, which that was in the year 70. So unless he had a magic 8-ball that told about the Jewish war and the destruction of the Jewish temple, then either it's heavily redacted and that's sort of integral to the plot, or that's just not how time works. So I don't know how we place him before the events.
Well, the difference would
referencing.
Be Mark is, if he's making that reference, I don't think that he explicitly makes a reference to the destruction of the temple in past tense. But if he does make a reference, it would be in future tense, speaking of when Yeshua talks about the future of the destruction of the temple. But even then, That's the only gospel where you could say that would be the case. Matthew and Luke were written around about the same time at about 85 to 90 AD, as is accepted.
Well, I mean, I just really have to dispute your whole.
Those are the
as
earliest
accepted by most
dates
scholars.
that they could have been. I mean, scholars say early date for Mark 70, but possibly as late as like 115.
Negative. The numbers I have officially are 66 to 70.
Who officially?
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to ask again the same question to you. Who are you citing? Where are you getting this late date from?
Well,
No, I'm not saying that is the latest date. What I'm saying is we have references to the Gospel of Mark in the early 2nd century. So that means it had to have been written by that point. Okay, I think it's like 115 or 125, somewhere around there. I believe, was it Justin Martyr, I believe, begins quoting the Gospel of Mark. Before that, we don't have any external reference to that gospel by anyone. And so if he's referencing material, if he's referencing events that happened in the year 70, like the destruction of the temple, which he's quite clearly doing, then written sometime after the year 70, and if the gospel is then quoted by someone around somewhere between 115 and 125, then it had to have been written before that point. So somewhere between 70 and 125.
So
that would be the window, and it could be anywhere in there. And some scholars want it to be early. That way they can potentially have eyewitnesses still around, even though the Gospel of Mark doesn't even claim to have any eyewitness accounts.
Right. So I see the mistake.
History.
I see the mistake that you're making is you're basing when it was written based on when other people start quoting it, rather than by the actual dates of manuscript fragments that.
No, I'm saying that's the window.
Times.
I'm not saying that's when it was written. I'm saying that is when it could have been written, somewhere between 70 and 115 or 125.
Right. So how do you account for manuscript fragments that do date to much earlier than that?
What manuscript fragments? Because the earliest manuscript fragments we have of any of our Gospels, I think P52 is the earliest one. It is not the Gospel of Mark. I believe it's the Gospel of John, and it's anywhere from the end of the 1st century to the end of the 2nd century. And you cannot conclusively date these things to a tighter window than about 75 to 100 years, because the carbon dating can't get it down any closer than that. The writing style, they can't pin it down any closer than that. And the way that they manufacture the papyrus, while that does change a bit, they can't get that pinned down any closer than that. Actually, Bart Ehrman talks about P52, and which is our earliest fragment of any gospel. And even he agrees that it cannot be definitively placed anywhere in the 1st century. It could be middle of the 2nd century or even later.
Right. Well,
real quick, P52 is that big, and it only has one complete word. That's the Greek word for and then a handful of fragments of words. And by that, they say, we think this is the Gospel of John, but there's no way of using that to determine how close its gospel is to the John that we currently have, because, like I said, it only contains one complete word. We don't get good fragments of manuscripts until the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. So,
surviving manuscripts, that is.
Well,
right. I mean, everything we have from that we can definitively place to the 2nd century are all fragments.
Okay,
we don't get whole manuscripts until
I don't have a problem with accepting that we have fragments that go from before that, and by the time we have better, completer fragments, it's much later in history. That's pretty common throughout antiquity, and I would even say that's common all the way up until even the 15th and 16th century in American and European history.
Yeah,
that not a single original document exists of Shakespeare. We only have copies. So,
okay. Well, I'm wondering if we can kind of move off of this particular part of the topic. I'm perfectly fine accepting the dates of 70 CE for Mark, 80 between 80 and 90 CE, for Matthew between at least after 93 CE for Luke, and then John is definitely early 2nd century. I mean, that's gonna land you like right in the middle of the scholarly consensus. And I mean, I can throw out references like Bart Ehrman here if you want me to. While I disagree with his position on the historical Jesus, I think he's got really solid work on dating when the Gospels were written and validating that they were copied off of each other. So I feel like I don't know if we can come to an agreement on the dates, but I know somebody had brought up the other historical figures. I'm just wondering if maybe I can throw in the question of, can you name me one other historical figure that we accept as historical but have less evidence for?
Shakespeare. Shakespeare, Alexander the Great, William Wallace, King Arthur, Robin Hood, Socrates.
Wait, do we?
Ooh, spicy. So I'll make sure they get right back to that one. And I warned them, just so you guys know, I warned them that we're going to do a break here because I want to make sure that everybody knew that's in the chat. First and foremost, thanks for hanging out with us at the Atheist Roundtable for TART Live Debate Night. And after the debate tonight, we're going to have a TART Live watch party for the McGregor fight. So if you want to be part of that, email me, austin@tart.live. And as soon as the debate is over, I'll shoot the links out, and anyone and everyone is welcome to come hang out with us, unless your name is like Ken Ham or some shit like that. You can't hang out, but everybody else can come hang out, and we'll make it happen, Captain. But everybody in the chat, thank you so much for chilling out with us. I've been going through there. There's too many people in there for me to go give all the shout outs to. But I do want to say that we are going to have a little bit of a special guest tonight with us. So we haven't seen in a couple episodes. Oh yeah, that guy, he's going to be back. So you already know when that pretty little face pops up, it's almost Q&A time. So I will put up on the screen when it's time to start putting your questions up there, and starting that the easiest. So remember, everyone, I am ADHD. If you want to make sure your questions get read, the super chat's the best way because I see callers really well. And I follow callers really well, but we'll get back into the chat here. We'll give them another 15-20 minutes before we go to Q&A. And I just want to say to the gentlemen involved, Bradley and Seamus, Godless Engineer, Jason, thank you so much so far for a great interaction, great debate. Let's get it.
Okay.
Okay. So King Arthur was mentioned. I'm not exactly sure if we accept King Arthur.
I don't. I think he was myth.
So
I want to touch on Alexander the Great, though. Can I do that real quick? So, because I looked that up real quick because I'd actually bumped into this just the other day. So, we have historians such as Diodorus, Dionysius, Rufus, Trogus, Plutarch, and Arrian all writing about Alexander the Great, and their accounts were based on written records composed by contemporaries and eyewitnesses of Alexander, and these include Callisthenes, Ptolemy, Nearchus, Aristobulus, and Onesicritus. And this, I think Arrian was probably the one of the most well-respected, who used the majority of these sources, compared and contrasted them to dig to the bottom and find, the best possible accounts of this by the ones that all sort of supported one another, despite, minor discrepancies. But that isn't even all, because we have contemporary references in from Isocrates, Demosthenes, Dianarchus, Theocritus, Menander, and Theophrastus, On top of that, we also have in contemporary, so during his lifetime, coins, inscriptions, and even statues. And the exact date and time of his death was even noted by Persian astrologers, and we have those clay tablets. Those still exist, and we have nothing of the sort, of any of those types of things. We have no contemporary mentions of Jesus, not even by Christians, and certainly not by respected historians, either during his lifetime or in the years between then and the Gospels.
All counts as
And
contemporary.
we don't have inscriptions, we don't have statues, we don't have anything. We don't even have names of eyewitnesses. That doesn't even come about until our Gospels, who then take characters from Paul's letters and sort of recast them. Now, it could have been eyewitnesses, but we don't know.
So real quick. So yes, one thing that you said is absolutely correct. Arianus is accepted as being one of the more accurate accounts to Alexander the Great, in addition to Diodorus. The sources that you mentioned that they pull from are as fictitious as Q. There is no existing even a fragment of them. So
no, the
your written sources are Q at this point.
They're not. No. Those written sources no longer exist, but we have extensive quotations from those sources in those named historians.
We have the same.
That's Matthew, Mark, Luke.
No. It's not. Okay,
who's a source for Mark?
The difference.
Who's a source for Mark?
Let me explain. Let me just explain real quick how ridiculous it is to suppose that second or third hand documentation of something is the same as a hypothetical document that people just made up because it seemed easier to make up this hypothetical source to explain things. For one thing, second and third hand sources for things are something that historians do all the time. We have a number of things. I mean, you guys used second-hand or third-hand information in your opening arguments when you talk about Papias and all that. I mean, when you talk about that, you're talking about other people that have written about what he's saying. I distinctly remember you guys referencing Eusebius, who talks about something that Papias said about Hebrew gospel or something like. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. I don't exactly remember. It feels like 10 years ago, right at this point. My point is that to compare it to a hypothetical source is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I just want to know who the source is for Mark, because you said that we had similar for Jesus that we have for Alexander. So I just named 5 different sources whose writings were then extensively copied and quoted by these different historians.
Yeah.
Who is one of the sources that Mark used? Do we have a name of any of them? And
yeah. So according to Polycarp, Papias, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome, Mark was a disciple of Peter, and he wrote down everything Peter taught him.
Wait. So you guys literally think that John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark?
The name Mark wasn't even attached to that gospel until the middle of the 2nd century. Before that, it was just known as the Gospel. They were all anonymous. None of them have a Bible. Right. Those names,
what we're saying
even when they were
attached,
they weren't even. Attached, they weren't even considered to be the authors.
Clement and Polycarp and Papias and Ignatius all say that Mark was a disciple of Peter, and he wrote down everything that Peter taught him.
Okay. How would they know?
I'm asking about Mark himself.
Can we compare and
source?
Well, there's that. Where does Mark give a source? Where does Mark say it? Or what we know of as the Gospel of Mark. But also, can you guys compare the time frames on that? These people that claim John Mark was a student of Peter or whatnot, how far removed are they from even a possible figure that was Mark?
Polycarp was a disciple of John.
No.
Yes.
Now,
Polycarp
can
was.
you cite me a source where Polycarp claims that? You can't, because Irenaeus is actually the one that tells us that Polycarp was a disciple of John or whatever. So, I mean, not even Polycarp says that he was the disciple of John.
I need to double check that.
Yeah, at this point, you're not really using equal standards of evidence because if we're going to compare the actual time difference, the written accounts, which subsequently no longer exist, of Alexander the Great, who were contemporaries of him, you're talking people who lived in 360 BC versus people who are in the year 30 BC.
Oh, okay. Well, so going back to the Alexander the Great thing, Irenaeus, he actually cites like the works and the people that he pulled from. Now, does Polycarp or Irenaeus do they do this? Do they cite it in the same way that Arian did for Alexander the Great?
Does Mark?
Or does Mark?
I mean, how did they cite it? You're asking for like a stylistic citation, or what exactly are you asking for? Because
like an Arian,
we have evidence that Mark was a disciple of Peter.
Well, like a name, so like for instance, Arian cites I believe two of his sources were actually generals of Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
And so he names them. Arian would have had access to the documents in which he is referencing as
being. Do you
being
have evidence outside of their writings that they were generals?
Huh?
Do you have evidence outside of their written accounts that these people were generals of Alexander the Great?
I mean, they would have had they had tombstones, you know, where they
do we have
the writings of other eyewitnesses? The writings of other eyewitnesses who give accounts to Alexander do name his generals.
Yeah.
So,
you mean the other writings of eyewitnesses that also don't exist anymore?
These are writings that were extensively quoted by a half dozen different historians over the next couple of centuries, and we have nothing of the sort for Jesus.
You understand, you come up short in the exact same way that you are trying to argue that the Gospels come up short.
No.
You're trying to hold to a standard of evidence that you cannot furnish.
These historians name and quote their sources, and independent historians are quoting the same sources that other independent historians also quote, and these quotations match up. They name their sources, they say where they got their information, how they used the information, how they verified the information. When we look at the Gospel of Mark, he doesn't even claim that he's using eyewitness sources. He doesn't say where he got his information, how he got his information, how it was verified, if it was verified. He just starts a third-person omniscient narrative and goes on for there. And it's the same with all of our other Gospels. And this is an anonymous author. We have the names of these historians who do this. We have no idea who wrote this random anonymous Gospel, which is one of about 40 different Gospels.
It's a little more fishy. Like, you understand how that's even a little more fishy, right? Because you're talking about different people who are all quoting the same people that you can't furnish proof of, right? So you have the same problem where these sources that they're quoting are more likely to actually be made up at this point. If we're applying
so two independent people both copy the same thing, ridiculous. And that original thing must be made up because two different people who lived a century apart and both copied from the same source independently of one another, somehow both spontaneously invented the same thing verbatim.
You understand now why your assertion about the Gospels doesn't make any sense, because what you just described is the Gospel accounts.
No. Okay. So the Gospels are considered anonymously written for good reason. They weren't given titles whatsoever until Papias. Papias is the one that titled them, gave them titles. So the fact that the fact that
Papias's writings don't exist anymore. only those fragments that I quoted. So you cannot, and here I actually have it pulled up. Papias only says this about Mark, that his capacity as Peter's interpreter wrote down accurately as many things he could recall from memory that Peter had taught him, and that Matthew had written his gospel in the Hebrew language. Those are the only two things that exist of Papias. Everything else is by Eusebius.
And it was like this is a copy that Eusebius has laid down, right? It's a
Eusebius
reference
also
in
quotes
Eusebius.
a similar copy on John the Elder. Eusebius quotes Papias for John the Elder.
Okay, I don't understand why there's like a problem with secondary sources all of a sudden, like that you guys have a problem with it. All we're asking is for where in Mark does it say that Mark wrote it? You can't say the title of it because they didn't title their works like that. It didn't originally have the title of the gospel according to Mark. That was later. There was a later thing that was given to it. It was just the gospel of Jesus, as it was known to them. So unless you can provide a citation within Mark where he claims to have been John Mark, there's literally no reason to think that John Mark wrote Mark. And so just by the way, we are in the minority with thinking that Jesus probably didn't exist, right? We're in the minority. But also, I want you guys to consider that a lot of the positions that you have stated tonight, you are in the minority of the consensus scholarship. Like with John Mark writing Mark and all of the names on the Gospels actually being the ones that wrote the Gospels.
So when somebody gives an account of who wrote the Gospels via a second hand, such as Papias saying that Mark wrote his, you're saying that because Mark doesn't cite himself in his own writings, that somebody else does, that it is therefore invalid. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying that the Gospel of Mark was written most likely around 70 AD. Papias wasn't writing until the 2nd century. How could Papias know who wrote that Gospel? It's completely anonymous.
Yeah.
Right.
Unless he gives some way of saying, how he came upon that information and verified that information, then...
Right. So you understand that almost an identical time difference exists between the current writings that exist about Alexander the Great and the sources they claim to be citing. There's almost an identical time difference.
Papias didn't live in the 2nd century. He lived in the 1st century. He died in the 2nd century, early 2nd century at that.
I guess I don't have his birth and death date memorized.
From 60 to 130.
Okay, yeah, but when it's my understanding that Papias was writing in the 2nd century about these things.
So
he would have been 10 years old when this was written?
He would have been 10 years old when Jesus was alive. It's believed that he wrote his fragments at some point in the 90s.
No. Actually, the scholarship says that, which I've got on my app here, a nice little chronology thing. Papias was most likely writing 110 to 130.
Yeah, it says he was born around 70 AD. So Papias couldn't have been writing during the time that Jesus was alive if he would have been born around the earliest dating for Mark. I'm just trying to understand who Mark's source was. Where do we have, in the Gospel of Mark or in any of the Gospels where they name a source and, how they got their information, how they verified it, and how they're using that information. The same way we have with these historians who chronicle the life of Alexander the Great, who frequently cite their sources and explain where they got their information and how they verified it and used it.
Right, but you can't prove that their sources actually exist.
They're claiming a source, and the source doesn't exist.
Okay,
that's the problem.
Listen.
How they copy these things verbatim that other people also copy verbatim, and move on to our Gospels. So, they can't cite sources. They don't even quote sources. They don't even say that they are based on any sources, with the exception of, I believe, John, who says it's based on the beloved disciple, who might be Lazarus, who's a zombie. So that's problematic.
So hold on. Just so that we put
Yeah.
this in perspective here of what we're asking for, with the analogy with Alexander the Great, we have Arian, right, and that's comparable to Mark, if you will, and with Arian.
No,
like Arian from 300 AD. Is that the one?
Arian would be comparable to Papias. Mark would be comparable to Anascritos.
No, I'm disregarding time frame here because I mean Arian had access to the original, not original documents, but the documents that he was referencing to write his biography about Alexander the Great. I'm saying that what we have here is the narrative, the Arian's narrative, where he cites actual sources for his information. We're not asking for somebody to provide the sources that Arian was quoting. What we're asking is for Mark to provide some kind of reference to a historical person or some kind of historical source for the information in his gospel. That's what we're asking for here. I feel like something's getting lost in translation.
The difference is Mark was not a historian. Historians always cite their sources because they're doing it for the purpose of history. Mark was not writing a historical account. He was writing a story, and eventually, and he's not a historian, so he doesn't write like a historian. He writes like a Jewish man.
Right.
So Mark is in history.
Got
it.
Information.
No, Mark is still history because it is still a witness account of some sort that can be used as a form of evidence.
Oh, but you said it was just a claim.
He's an
Mark himself was not a historian. Okay, that would be like somebody who's not a historian writing some sort of letter, and then we go, well, substantiate it. He wouldn't do it in the same way that I would do it because I'm a historian and I'm trained as such. So I know how to write a piece of history in order to make it substantiable. Whereas Joe Schmo, who's giving testimony in court, doesn't do it in the same way. That doesn't make his account any less authentic. It just means it isn't written the same.
All right, so I'm gonna press pause, and I think this deserves a round two.
It does.
This was great, and I know it can be peaks and valleys in these types of debates where you're feeling good in some, you're frustrated in others. But I think that's part of this, and that's how we get to truth. You know, that's how we get to it. So I think it's amazing. So this deserves a round two. If the four of you are up to it, we will schedule a round two on that, and I would love to listen. This was the time flew. Time flew on this one. It was amazing. But Jason, I want to ask you a very, very serious question. Okay, and I don't know if there's ever been this serious of a question ever asked to you before. But have you ever seen the inside of a murder shed before?
Only once, and I barely escaped.